Find a gang to join anywhere in the whole state, let alone one that didn't laugh my white ass back to my middle-class verbs. It was ridiculous, more nuts than Iron Maiden making devil music. I remember looking at my friend and just saying, my mom's fucking insane.
Wingardium Leviosa.
We would play in the basement of a huge train depot. There were homeless people there that used to hang out and watch. Funniest story was when the cops came to raid the place. They were looking for someone in particular but he wasn't there. When they found the four of us sitting at an old table on milk crates with candles and flashlights surrounded by some of the local homeless people, they kind of freaked. We explained that we were just playing Dungeons and Dragons and the homeless people were cheering us on. They told us to be careful and left.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Greater than make a bear character in D&D 3.5. Greater than DM laughs. Greater than make bear a rogue, put every point I can into disguise. Greater than prestige class as a spy to get more disguise. Greater than DM says I can't speak English. Greater than max out bluff. Greater than by growling and gesturing, I can fake speaking a language I don't speak, English. Greater than use money to hire a butler NPC. Greater than give him a magical item to let him speak bear. Grow wool. An excellent suggestion, Mr. Barrington. We really should ask the group to investigate the Black Marsh. Greater than over the course of the game, be knighted as Sir Barrington. Greater than Queen holds a dinner in my honor. Greater than a guest becomes the first man to ever make a perception check that can beat my disguise. Greater than shouts out loud. Hey, that guy's not a guy, he's just a bear. Greater than man is escorted out of the castle while the guards apologize profusely for the indignity. We're so sorry, Sir Barrington, very sorry for this.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Man's behavior. Raw shrug.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Old fart reporting in. Started playing in 1979 before school with some fellow speech and debate geeks and a couple other kids. Towards the end of the year, we brought our stuff into the actual S&D classroom. We had a speech and debate team, which was extracurricular, and also an elective class, which really only consisted of people on the team. As an educator now, not sure how this was kosher, but I digress. Our teacher/coach became very interested in D&D and would hang out in the back of the room with us when she was supposed to be critiquing kids on their pieces for the next tournament. We rolled her up a character, and she chose a chaotic evil magic user. Within a few days, one of the kids in class reported what was going on to their Pentecostal parents, and our game was shut down, due to satanic worship on school grounds. Probably didn't help when our teacher,
Wingardium Leviosa,
declared after a fight with town guards, I rip the heart from the guard's chest and eat it. Our teacher was really into her character.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I'm gonna throw this one out there because it's kind of funny. So, I was introduced to D&D by way of my friends that played Magic, the Gathering back when it first came out, 93-94. They were all more than a little weird, but the good kind of weird, so I thought I'd join in. As I was getting to know the group, there was a kid, friend of a friend, who was totally unhinged. This kid was a few years older than us, probably 14 at the time, and totally believed he was his character. I'm not talking the method actors we all know and love, but this kid legitimately believed he was a dark elf ranger who could sense danger and had a fairy companion. The few times he showed up to hang out with us while playing MTAG were an experience. Usually he'd stick around a few minutes, then whisper I sense danger, and disappear for a few hours and come back looking like he'd been wandering a
Wingardium Leviosa.
briar patch the whole time, covered in leaves and scratches. The stories my friends would tell about his antics scared me shitless, and I assumed it was the D&D that had sent him over the edge. I never really got an explanation as to why he'd never gotten help, but I think his parents were the type that believed in past lives and that kind of stuff, so maybe they were just okay with it. I ended up moving to another a few months after meeting this kid, but I always thought that it was the D&D that fucked the kid up. A few years later, my brother was introduced to the Star Wars RPG by one of his friends, 2E, R&E published by West End Games, for those who care, and I was totally against him doing it. I told him about this mental case and tried to scare him away from starting to play. My dad told me to chill the fuck out, to let my brother decide for himself, and maybe to give it a whirl myself. Well, I did, and that was that. 20 years later, I'm still RPGing. Funny note, I later found out that my dad was a registered DM, and had at least one retired 20th level character, what he describes as a wizard/dragon friend, that had actually been verified by TSR, and the bitch he married made him throw it all away and give it up right before I was born. Ironically, I wasn't allowed to own any magic card until I was in college due to the same psychopathic bitch thinking they were tarot cards. TLDR, I was the one convinced it was gonna ruin my brother, and my dad is a bigger nerd than I ever thought possible.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I started playing D&D in the early 80s, when it was fairly new. Over the years, I played dozens of different RPGs, but the original D&D has a special place in my heart. As far as the demon summoning angle, I remember when it started to become a big deal. My mom was a teacher and she went to a seminar on D&D and devil worship. When the lady giving the seminar starting explaining the dangers of playing, my mom called her out on it. She told her that her kids play, all their friends play, and we are all smart, well-adjusted kids with good grades. Given that the lady giving the seminar hadn't even met anyone who had ever played the game, my mom basically dropped the mic on her. I never did summon a demon, but I did once have a dragon punch me.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Oh yeah. Right around when I first started with the old red basic D&D set, my family's GP retired and the new quack who took over his practice spent about 3/4 of my physical trying to talk me into recognizing the danger to my soul that the game represented. He also misdiagnosed me as having anemia despite lacking any symptoms, same as my mom and great aunt, which I quickly figured out was part of his racket to prescribe unnecessary vitamin shots. I insisted on going back to my pediatrician for a second opinion, and stuck with him as my doctor until adulthood. We later found out that quack doctor got arrested for diddling teenage boys, so I have a sneaking suspicion his concern about my spiritual well-being may not have been genuine.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Obligatory. Not an 80s player, but when I first got into the game, in early high school, my dad, a Christian missionary, was one of those people who thought Pokemon and Harry Potter were gateways to devil worship. The first time I played, I mentioned to my dad that I'd watched some friends play, since that was kind of my litmus test for if something was of the devil. I got a lecture on how the game was evil and it led to devil worship and to suicide, so I played in secret for a few weeks before the game fell apart. No huge drama. The weird part was a few years later, after I came back from my first semester of college, I mentioned I had ran a game because fuck you dad, I do what I want. He thought it was cool, and said something along the lines of, did you know in the 80s people thought this game was demonic? Ha! And then we played a family game.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Over Christmas break. Weirdest shit ever.
Wingardium Leviosa.
In the late 80s, I was in high school, and a group of us who were playing taught a younger kid who lived in the neighborhood. He bought some dice, at least one rule book, and a few miniatures. Several months later his mom flipped out and made him burn, yes, literally burn, all of it. Sometime later, his mom gave a video to my mother, they were friends, about how D&D was satanic. She got mildly worried and made me watch it with her. I laughed and laughed at how ridiculous the video was. While I was making fun of it, she calmed down and stopped the video.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Well, some of our D&D games were once held in church function rooms and libraries, just to tell you how it all suddenly reversed. I blame the whole moral majority movement pushed by Pat Robertson, Oral Roberts, President Reagan, Jim, and Tammy Faye Baker, and the like. Most were televangelists, most who all eventually ended up being part of some sex or money scandal. D&D was not the top of their list, but it certainly affected us gamers. Our local Crown Books chain used to carry D&D in supplements, but eventually were pressured to stop. Before that happened, I was accosted by some woman who said I was into devil worship. I couldn't think of what to say, so I said it was probably too late, so I was going to have fun while I was still alive. She didn't take that well at all, and asked where my parents were. I told her at home. She made a comment about me being alone at my age,
Wingardium Leviosa.
leading to me being astray, and I said I was 15 and already had a job. I had yet to learn some people don't like being corrected. One of our friends who had rich parents had nearly everything D&D imaginable. Then his parents decided D&D was devil magic, burned all his books, and he wasn't allowed to play with us anymore. I recall being mortally offended that they chose to burn the books instead of give them away. Hair. A lot of TV talk shows would have an episode of D&D, and usually the set they had was all candlelit with people working in dark rooms, speaking in mumbling tones. The video camera would tilt back and forth, slowly fading from shot to shot, like what they thought an acid trip must look like. None of us player were like that at all. We needed bright lighting to read that damn small font TSR often used in modules. I don't know any gaming group that used dramatic lighting. I would have laughed at any that did. Oh God, the story about James Egbert would not stop getting airplay. I was so sick of that story. That and mazes and monsters. It was the only two things the media had, really, and they milked that cow bone dry. I did press relations with a science fiction convention back then, and one reporter described our game room, a function room with gamers pretty much anyone has seen in every con ever, as a backroom den filled with smoke and gambling. What smoke? We weren't allowed to smoke in hotels. That reporter already had an agenda, and that was a lesson learned on my part. Lucky for me, they spelled my name wrong in the paper, too, so anyone looking for me would have a time finding me out. The biggest thing that upset me were people would make all kinds of comments about devil worship without opening one book or attending one game. But these people also did that with everything. I don't have to read or understand anything to dislike it and declare it harmful for humanity.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I was a casual role player. The gang wanted me to commit to a game. I got invited to hang out with my female friends. I didn't want to play that day, but I promised, so I did. My defiance was passively on display by my two elven characters Santa and Goofy. Goofy usually did the dumbest thing that a character could do. Santa was making a list every chance I got. When I was ordered to do something else, as everyone was tired of me always making a list, I decided to check it. When they couldn't stand me checking it, I insisted that I must check it thoroughly, and do so twice. Meanwhile, the DM had a great game prepared that he had saved for us. The first key moment was to go into a cave. Goofy was the first in. The extremely large sleeping spider was no match for Goofy's insistence to sing and dance and just make as much noise as possible. At request of the
Wingardium Leviosa
group, I had to roll against luck and intelligence several times, for the hope that Goofy might get serious in a life or death situation. I always failed. Those two characters were quite difficult to level up.
Wingardium Leviosa.
My dad played D&D in the 80s. His parents were divorced and his mom had bought him the set that he and his friends used, and his dad and stepmom were/are very religious. So after visiting his mom one time, he showed up back at his dad's house to discover that his D&D set and records were all missing. He asked his stepmom about it and she told him that she and his dad had taken all of it and burned it. Big fight ensues, he goes to live with his grandparents, and he still has a bit of resentment towards them. I think they finally apologized when he was like 40-ish.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I played with a kid who had to keep it a secret because his mom didn't want him to play. Didn't own any of the books or anything, and kept his character sheet at my house. Mostly, the kids I played with were college professors' kids, so they didn't believe any of that crap. The worst thing that ever happened is one of us created a female paladin named I'm a Goddess in Bed, and we giggled whenever someone said her name. And then we all remained virgins until after high school.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Whenever this was mentioned, it was met with ill-concealed laughter. Normally it was people mentioning it in passing and by strangers. None of my friends was told that they couldn't play. Devil worship. Whatever, wanna see my dice collection? I got it in this sweet Crown Royal bag.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I grew up in Oklahoma City, the buckle of the Bible Belt, back in the 70s and 80s. One of the regular places my friends and I played D&D was in a prayer room of the local Southern Baptist church. Preacher knew what was up and thought it was neat game, but never played. I never, ever, once heard a sermon about the evils of D&D from him or the preacher at the Bethany First Church of the Nazarene where my friend's family attended.
Wingardium Leviosa.
As an 80s D&D player, let me just say, having D&D type stuff, like World of Warcraft, be totally accepted and normal nowadays, sucks total donkey ass. First, it sucks for me, because back in the 80s, you got a bad reputation when people found out you played D&D. And not the kind of bad reputation that makes girls in high school sleep with you. The opposite kind of bad reputation. Big time. It was almost a one-shot kill for your social life. So for those of us who had to go through all of that just for a game we loved, it's kind of a slap in the face that it's totally accepted nowadays. Second, though, it sucks for all the young kids today. Because one of the results of the amazing social ostracism that came with playing D&D is that you really bonded with your fellow players, many of whom were legitimately interesting people. So the game may have cost you a lot of superficial
Wingardium Leviosa.
friends, but it also bought you a lot of really meaningful friends. I was part of 3 different D&D groups over the years, and I remember virtually everyone I ever played with. And I could sit down with any of those people, many of whom I've not seen in decades, and we could start talking almost immediately. And young players are never going to know that, because now that the hobby is mainstream, there's nothing special about it. TLDR, get off of my damn lawn.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Pentecostal. I am unfamiliar with that belief system. Is it Christian or terrorist?
Wingardium Leviosa.
Grew up like this in Florida, can speak in tongues. Can confirm. Went on a missions trip when I was 13 and we were at a training facility in Garden Valley, Texas, which when I checked years ago was on the FBI watch list as a cult facility. Some teenage missionaries had just gotten back from the Caribbean, and been freaked out by some of the voodoo rituals and culture they had witnessed there. Being the mischievous bastard I was, I took my tongue speaking to a whole other level and starting jumping around muttering to myself and convinced them all that I was possessed. Now, there were a couple thousand people camped out in the middle of the desert, and this was a big facility. All of the pastors that could be, were gathered to lay hands on me and pray for me. The pastors from my own church were there, and I could see them straining to fight back laughter because they knew me and already
Wingardium Leviosa.
knew I was bullshitting everybody. One strange prayer later, laden with tongue speaking, I was cured and fine and couldn't remember what had happened and played dumb. Smile, true story.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Wasn't even the 80s. I was in college in the early 2000s and mostly me and my friends played in the lobby of one of the quieter dorms. One time a presumably super religious person tried to get us to stop because magic comes from the devil. I explained that of the 6 people in the room, he was apparently the only one who believed in magic.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Why was D&D considered satanic?
Wingardium Leviosa.
You know how society and the media constantly shift outrage to seemingly random things. For example, Ellen coming out as gay or red Starbucks cups near Christmas. It's nothing new. In this case, I think it was mostly religious groups, seizing on what looked like a perfect scapegoat of the devil is coming for your children through this evil game.
Wingardium Leviosa.
A friend of mine's mom was convinced that D&D was satanic, demonic, whatever. In an attempt to scare my friend away from playing, the mom related a story to them of how the parents of a mutual friend of their family had thrown their child's D&D books into the fireplace, and how they all heard the demons in the pages scream as the books burnt up. Friend's response was to keep playing.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I never really felt like I did anything wrong, until many years later. I'm more than a little ashamed to admit that I did play a session of 4th edition. There's no God powerful enough to forgive that. Now that's some sea shit right there.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I'm an 80s baby and started playing D&D in the early 90s. My friend's mom thought it'd be awesome to help us learn math and social skills, so once a week she'd run little light-hearted adventures for us. She even make little wooden swords and shields based off of our characters we played, so we had life-sized examples on how big and heavy weapons were. My dad knew and he was okay with it and thought it was a great idea to get us to study history and such. My mom is a devout Catholic, and he didn't tell her out of fear of what she'd do. She finally found out about 6 or 7 months into the game sessions. I remember we were playing and she showed up at the house and very angrily asked the DM mom to step outside. They then proceeded to scream about God, faith, math, innocence and fantasy. My mom took me out and I wasn't allowed over there anymore, but her son could hang out at our house. What she
Wingardium Leviosa.
never knew was he smuggled over a bunch of books his mom bought me. I still have them to this day and I've been a D&D player since. I still hold games every week and don't regret anything.
Wingardium Leviosa.
This isn't an experience from the 80s, in fact it's from only about 5 to 8 years ago. I had been playing D&D for a few years and all my parents really knew about it was that it wasn't a video game, and I was a friend's house, not getting up to trouble. That was it. They were happy. My mom joined a Bible study group with some of the ladies from her church, and at some point during a study session, one of the ladies brought up her 2 boys being bored during the summer and getting up to no good. Well, my mom chimed in with that guy Dave 89 plays D&D with his friends and really seems to enjoy it. Plus it keeps it out of trouble. Apparently the looks of shock among some of the ladies was quite the sight to see. They began to lecture her about how I was bringing Satan into my life and how the D&D rule books are on the level of satanic texts. She came home and told me this. I chuckled, handed
Wingardium Leviosa.
her the 4th edition handbook and a few of the other books, and after about 5 minutes of skimming, she came to the conclusion that the ladies were clearly overreacting and that it was so complicated. She was happy I was using my brain instead of drinking/smoking it away. So yay, This was in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and that demon worship misnomer is still alive and well.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I started playing in the late 80s, in full swing of the Satanic Panic going on around D&D. My parents were awesome and never gave me any shit about it. I have an older brother who was a big troublemaker, so they were just happy I wasn't being arrested. But I had acquaintances at school who were dicks about it and would ask me bluntly if I worshipped the devil. Yeah, dumbass, I worship the devil and I wear a cross, right side up, around my neck. And my youth minister was a huge dick about it. I was Methodist, so not a church you hear of and think those guys are backwards dickheads. But he gave me shit about D&D and also listening to metal. Is it any wonder I lost my faith? I still play, and my husband plays. Oh, and that troublemaker brother. He's a born-again Christian fundamentalist, who thinks D&D and Harry Potter are literally witchcraft. I just can't fucking win. Frown?
Wingardium Leviosa.
Christmas of '89, we went to my grandma's house with that side of the family. My odd, but nice, cousin who taught me all about the space shuttle and gave me a copy of The Hobbit got his own copy of the AD&D2E manual. One of the aunts flipped her shit and told him he needed to burn that book in the fireplace right now. She continued to tell us all the ways that he could summon demons, cast spells, etc., from this book. He got very sad and upset, but most of the family just laughed at her, since she was already the shitty aunt who brought the warm deviled eggs and cheap Kool-Aid. I got really, really mad at my mother, who had explained to me on the ride over that I could not, in fact, grow up to be a Ghostbuster. Somebody was lying.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I knew that the bad press was there, but it didn't really affect me. I started playing around late '81, joined a real gaming group in mid '82. The kid whose house we played at was from a very religious family, and they didn't have a problem with the game. The messes we left behind, on the other hand. The only negative feedback I got was when I moved to a new town in a new state in '83. I met a few kids, had no idea who was into what, kind of threw D&D out in casual conversation in front of the mother of one of the neighborhood kids, and she said yes, we've heard about that game. Made it clear she didn't approve. Didn't really matter. Her kid wasn't going to play it anyway, not his thing. The horror stories were out there, and I was aware of them, and I'm sure lots of people had different experiences, but it really didn't get to me much.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I started playing in the early '80s. My first gaming group was a bunch of Mormon kids that went to the same church as my best friend/neighbor. So, all of the parents knew and were cool with it. A few years later we started hearing about it being associated with demon worship, etc. We just thought it was ridiculous that anyone would think that. Gaming nights were some of the most fun from my youth.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I grew up in the '80s and attended a Catholic school that had no problems with me running Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, Car Wars, Powers and Perils and the Ghostbusters RPG during recess. The Satanic Panic was some weird thing I saw on 60 Minutes once, and that was it.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Don't look at me. I was raised Episcopalian. We didn't believe Satanic Panic and all that horsebucky, to quote Father Mike. He even ran a week-long D&D camp at the Episcopal Church's campground in the '80s. I think it was just to show that it was all crap. D&D was a fun game, not some plot.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I didn't realize it at the time, but this is something that makes me go ha now. I had a friend whose parents were ultra-religious. Always going to church and super into everything to do with that whole scene. I even got bitched out large by his mom once because I said Jesus in her presence. My parents were not religious, so before that I honestly didn't even know some people didn't like that. Anyway, We always played D&D in the kitchen, talking about witches and spells and clerics and so on, and his parents didn't care. I guess not every religious person was caught up in that insanity. Mad respect to that guy's parents.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Semi-related, and a little late to the party. My mom became a Jehovah's Witness when I was 10 and married one a few years later. He introduced me to a game called Meridian 59, which is like World of Warcraft but late 90s. I fell in love with it. We moved on to EverQuest after that, and it was really the only thing we bonded over. Fast forward to 2008, and I introduce him to WoW. He loved it. I knew he would. Then one day the powers that be in Jehovah Witness land said it dealt with magic and demons and it wasn't acceptable to play it. He had to quit playing overnight, and I felt so bad for him. His love of fantasy does not match well with his faith. Poor bastard.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Spoke in tongues every weekend. And somehow it's acceptable and not creepy that you channel spirits associated with Yahweh. Believing in a god that isn't printed on the money though, that means you're a bad guy. Edir, a comment further down implies that speaking in tongues is essentially the same as demonic possession. And it is? It only depends on your definition of demon.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I asked a buddy to play, who asked his mom. She said no because we would summon demons. He told me this. It had never occurred to me. So we tried. Nothing happened. I told him to tell his mom that we tried but it's not real. He moved like a week later, I found out years later, not because of me.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I started playing D&D 2 years ago at the age of 28 after I told my girlfriend that all her D&D stories from college had me wanting to see what the fuss was about. So she did. She invited some of our nerd friends and found some more nerds on Reddit and started a campaign that we've been playing pretty much since. 6 months ago I was talking to my mother, a typical Jewish mother, liberal but protective, and told her I had to go get ready, since Julie had invited new friends she found online to join us for our weekly D&D night. In strained tone she asked, "So? She just found them? On the internet?" "Yeah," I explained. "That's how we'd met most of the people we play with." "Well? Okay. Just promise me that you'll be careful." At this point I asked her what on earth she was afraid of and discovered that she'd confused D&D with S&M. For over a year I'd told her about
Wingardium Leviosa.
how I got together with friends to role-play fights in dungeons and she'd thought we were flogging and spanking each other. I think it's doubly funny because we actually do dabble in some light kink. I live in LA, where both kinds of dungeon fantasy are barely outside the mainstream. In fact, I've noticed that they're often popular among the same people. So maybe the Christians did have something to fear after all. To my mother's credit, it's pretty open-minded of her to just nod and smile through that year of misunderstanding.
Wingardium Leviosa.
My neighbors across the street told me I had to stop playing D&D. I also was amateur magician. They said I had to stop that also. Once they went outside and were praying loudly for us holding Bibles. My stepfather was so frustrated he grabbed a Halloween mask and my magic cape and put them on a stick and was pacing back and forth while they were praying outside screaming Satan. That was one crazy night.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I went to a Lutheran school. Dungeons and Dragons was quite forbidden. My friends and I would play using codes that we would create. I learned the multiplication table because I could not afford to buy the monster manual. My teacher knew what we were doing, but she was so happy that my math scores had improved she didn't say anything. If the pastor would have found out I would have been paddled and possibly suspended.
Wingardium Leviosa.
My mother was a smoker. I had asked her to stop many times as it was killing her. Finally I said, "Would Jesus want you to kill yourself slowly due to smoking?" She retorted, "Would Jesus want you playing D&D?" I grabbed my books, and burned them in front of her. My hobby does not compare to your life. I'll happily give it up if you give up smoking. She stopped smoking. For a day. I went outside and caught her. I got in my car and got copies of the books I burned from the local comic store. This was one of many reasons I emancipated myself at 16.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I was obsessed with playing D&D with my friends in elementary and middle school. Didn't have any troubles until my cool 6th grade homeroom teacher let us play at school, forget why we had free time, and won kids, not a player. Parents freaked out and made a big to-do about us worshipping Satan on school property. My mom was worried about my possible devil worship. I listened to a lot of metal bands too, but never stopped me from playing, so we just continued playing at each other's homes. Her worrying never went much further than asking me periodically if I was suicidal, stabby, or other cliché 80s parental concerns.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I played in the Bay Area in California from '76-'79. I then moved to Mississippi and started gaming with locals. They were a bit behind and loved the grand Gothic mythos I brought with me. I never had a problem, never heard a bad word about it. Even in MS my only exposure to the hullabaloo was through the media.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I'm late, but I'll throw this out there. So I was 18 and living in a big old house in a crack neighborhood in 1989 with a bunch of punks and hippies. We played D&D all the time. This one girl, Linda, had this psychotic, religious mother. The minute Linda turned 18, she got the hell out of her mom's house and came to live with us. Of course it was very dramatic for her mother. One day Linda's mom comes over and we're all sitting around looking at D&D books. I was picking out a tattoo from the Fiend folio. I was sitting in a recliner. Some other people, maybe 3 to 4, were sitting on a daybed and the floor. So Linda's mom goes to court, along with her dad, and tells the judge that Linda has been inducted into a cult, of which I am the high priestess. She says she saw me preaching from those books and Linda turns all her money over to me, rent/utilities. They get a court order and
Wingardium Leviosa.
ambush Linda at dinner with a couple of cops. They take her to the hospital for a 3-day psych hold. Our friends and I take 3 buses across town to see Linda at the hospital, and we meet the doctor. He also meets the mother. He ends up releasing Linda early and tells her mother that she's the one who needs psych treatment. It was all very weird and confusing.
Wingardium Leviosa.
80s. Shit, I had to deal with that in the 2000s when I was in high school. My godmother was absolutely horrified when I told her I wanted to go to a friend's house to play D&D. Asked her why, she was convinced I was on my way to an orgy.
Wingardium Leviosa.
As if D&D ever lead to an orgy.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Actually, the first group I ever played in was about 10 people, pretty evenly split between boys and girls. All of us were pretty nerdy with basically no friends outside of this group. This was a major undertaking for a bunch freshmen in HS, and eventually the game broke down and most of the kids stopped showing up. Myself included, after the remaining couple of people started sneaking off to other rooms in the house to have sex, and I never got picked for it. Kind of soul-crushing for me at 14. I still am a super dorky adult, and am quite happily married now.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Not a typical D&D player. I used to read D&D-based fantasy novels and play the D&D-based computer role-playing games during that era, late 80s, early 90s. Mom is religious. Took my brother and I to a priest because we liked reading D&D novels and we played a game with possibly satanic symbols. To the priest's credit, he was like, shrug, whatever, not a big deal, but you guys know it's not real, right? My brother and I were thinking, are you fucking kidding me? Do you really think we can throw fireballs and orcs are going to fight us around every corner?
Wingardium Leviosa.
Well, I'm a 70s D&D player, still played into the noughties. At our school, when we wanted to have a D&D club, 1977-78, the chaplain insisted on watching the first couple of games to make sure that it was a suitable after-school activity. That lasted all of 30 minutes into the first session, till he rolled up his sleeves, rolled up his first character, a thief, if I recall correctly, and dived right in. So when the brouhaha started in the early 80s, he was able to stand up and defend us RPG players against the stupidity of gullible morons.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I was raised Pentecostal and spoke in tongues. Parents wouldn't let me play D&D, but they agreed to let me play a superhero RPG that was similar. Then one day my mom heard me talking about hexes in reference to the hexagon spaces on the game board. She thought it was witchcraft even after I explained what it was. No more RPG games for me after that. Now I'm an adult and I started a group that plays a Star Wars RPG game. Last I checked, I think we had over 100 members.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I had obliquely mentioned it to my youth minister. I think I was 11 or 12, 6th grade I guess. He went from a nice guy to talk to super serious, super determined to convince me that pretending to believe in spells and such was no different than actually believing it. That witchcraft was indeed real, and that Satan worshippers used this kind of information in their ceremonies and sacrificial rituals. I tried laughing it off, he wouldn't let it drop. I tried timidly disagreeing with him, he wouldn't let it drop. I tried agreeing on some points, he wouldn't have it. There was this strange passion against it, it seemed like it came out of nowhere, and I thought I knew the guy pretty well. But in my mind, I knew it was all bullshit. I couldn't believe that as a kid, I was already smarter than this learned, respected adult. Of course it was no different than pretending a skinny
Wingardium Leviosa.
tree branch was a lightsaber in my backyard. Of course it was no different than Santa or the Easter Bunny or what have you. I don't think that this gave me religious doubts per se, but it did make me think that I could make smarter decisions for myself than just taking an adult/teacher/authority figure's word on it.
Wingardium Leviosa.
I never really played D&D, but I did play a lot of Hero Quest and Battle Master. My dad was into it, but my mom went really religious and hated it. When they divorced, my HQ and BM games vanished. I was getting decent at drawing too. I would draw these fantastic scenes of ruins and wizards with lightning, really badass 80s shit. One day I come home from school to see my mom with a metal trash can in the driveway. She had me put all my drawings, my sketchbooks, my pencils, pens, and charcoals into the bin, and she lit it on fire. Burned everything I had created. Losing the drawings was painful as hell, but the thing that really destroyed me was a notebook I had designed my very own RPG in. It had overmaps, random encounters, dungeons with flaws. I would have a player play it and I would kind of DM the game, roll the encounters and enemy rolls, voice the NPCs, etc. All that went
Wingardium Leviosa.
into the fire. I stopped drawing that day. Now I can't draw for shit. I've tried to recapture the ability, but I don't have the muscle control, done countless exercises. Mom is a mess. I still have massive issues with her. I have a ton of stories. Bonus quick story, I found metal music thanks to Hell's Bells Christian anti-rock and roll propaganda movie.
Wingardium Leviosa.
D&D was never the problem, oddly. I was maybe around 10 year when I came home all excited and chatting up this really cool game that my best friend's cousin let us play. My mom basically just asked to look at the character sheet for my dwarf I'd made, asked me a bunch of questions about how you play, how characters are made. I think I remember her interested in character alignment and deities, which I thought was maybe the only boring part of the game. She seemed to think it was overall pretty harmless, at least from us kids' perspectives. She even helped me type up blank character sheets on our electronic word processor typewriter and photocopy a bunch of them. About a week later, my mom surprised me with the red beginner box set, and the blue expert box set, plus a set of dice. It was awesome. I guess she figured that the worst that would happen was I gonna be a dork. I was.
Wingardium Leviosa.
Already a die-hard 10-year Star Wars expert, so the Rubicon was crossed. There was never an issue with D&D after my mom sat down and looked everything over and asked questions instead of just buying into the hysteria. It's sort of surprising really. Iron Maiden was my favorite band at the time, but my mom was convinced they made devil worship music, so I wasn't allowed any of their albums, nor any IM posters that featured Eddie on them. Only posters of the band members themselves. My best friend used to bootleg copy the album's cassette tapes for me and write shit like Richard Marx and Air Supply on the label, and other lame shit so that I knew which album was which. In middle school, early 90s, my best friend and I were playing a homemade version of the Phaser-IP system based on Bloods and Crips gangs. Satan was basically old news, and Dr. Dre's The Chronic, and Ice-T's Cop Killer, and Cypress Hill were the thing that was scaring the living shit out of parents now. My best friend was in my room and we were playing and my mom burst into the room and just flipped the fuck out. She didn't even enter then flip her shit. She burst in with her shit already flipped. The only thing my friend and I later determined was that she must have been listening through the door. She came in screaming and fucked up our maps and tokens and dice. She grabbed all of our characters' sheets and notes and papers and tore them up into little prices and left the room hollering about how that game wasn't going to be played under her roof. She's not gonna have us becoming a bunch of damn gangbangers. Me and my friend just looked at each other like, what the fuck? I lived in Montana. Everyone around us was dumb fucking hicks and cowboys. Where the fuck was I gonna?
Wingardium Leviosa.
80s D&D players, what was your experience playing in the strange era of RPGs equals demon worship? Any crazy stories?
Hey guys, this is the Rogue YouTuber here. I recently had a big change in my life. I had a baby daughter. Here she is. If you could do me a favor and remember to hit the subscribe button and bang the bell, I'm hoping to really create a YouTube channel that really gets people excited and brings people the best, most interesting content collated from across the internet. I'm saving up to save my little girl to Carnegie Mellon Computer Science Department. So please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.